Hey guys, my name is Juan, I am just one reader, and today I have for you the Time and Place book tag. I think this tag was originally created by Jen Campbell, whose link I will leave down below on the description box. However, I saw this book tag very recently on Max's channel at Well Done Books, whose channel I will also link down below. So, the Time and Place book tag is really simple. You have to choose 10 books that you distinctly remember or, well, that you associate them with a time and place. For example, if I remember that I read a particular book in a particular time or moment or phase in my life or in a certain place, then I'm going to share that book with you and tell you what memory that book brings to me. So I'm going to show you 10 books that I very clearly remember having read at a particular place or time in my life and that have brought me so much joy or that just have had some very strong emotion attached to that reading experience. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So the first book that I'm going to share with you is actually a series of books, and it is A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. I read this back in elementary school when I was really young. These were probably the first books that I started reading on my own and that I started getting obsessed with. And I just remember I was addicted to these books, and they were selling this at my school because I studied at a bilingual school, so they had books in English, and they had the Series of Unfortunate Events. And I remember I must have been like 7 or 8 years old, and I read the first one, and I read it in one day, and I had to ask my parents to give me money to go to school the next day and buy the next one. And then the next day I had to go for the third one, and the next day I had to go for the fourth one, and so on until I had read pretty much the entire series, I think. And yeah, these were just like the first books that got me like, whoa. I mean, besides Harry Potter, these were the ones that gave me like this very strong emotion of, my God, reading is cool and it's great, it's immersive and it's fun, and I can learn things about the world and most importantly about myself. And yeah, this was probably like the first experience that really marked me as a reader. The second book that I'm going to share with you, I also read back in elementary school, and it's a middle grade novel by Philip Pullman, one of my favorite writers, and this novel is called Clockwork. This is the one that I read way back when in Spanish. And this was again one of those super immersive reading experiences. I remember I bought this, well, my parents bought it for me, and I remember it was like a very quiet night. I was alone at my house, and I just picked this book up. I had just bought it that same day. I opened it, I started reading the prologue, and Philip Pullman's prose is so enchanting, fairy tale-esque, and immersive and beautiful. And from the first paragraph, I was completely immersed, and I could not stop until I finished the book on the same night. And I just remember closing it, and it was like, I mean, I was fairly young, I was like 10 years old, and I felt that I had just like watched a movie in my head in one sitting, and I will always remember that feeling. The next book I'm going to show you is another book I read when I was very young, and it's The Secret of Platform 13 by Eva Ibbotson. And this was just so much fun. I remember there wasn't a particular like moment, or there was not a particular thing or activity I was doing that really reminds me of this book. I just remember I was so enthralled and so engrossed with this book. And this was just probably the first book that got me to think, whoa, authors are so smart. I mean, this sounds stupid, but like, I was so impressed by the creativity of Eva Ibbotson. She was comical, humorous, funny, witty, whimsical. With such an imagination, this immediately reminded me of the Harry Potter universe. And yeah, I started recommending this to everyone around me. I just love this book. The next book I'm gonna show you is The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. I read this when I was in 6th grade, I think, when I was about 11 years old. And this was like the ultimate immersive reading experience. I just remember this was the first book in my life that I had, because I was so obsessed with it and so addicted that I had to cheat. I mean, I had to trick my mom into believing that I was asleep. And instead, what I would do is I would crawl out of bed, I would lock myself in the bathroom and read all night long. And when I was 11 years old, I read this very chunky book in like 2 days. And I just remembered I was obsessed with the riddles, with the cleverness of all the clues and the challenges that the main character has to achieve, and I was just blown away, and that really got me into the whole thriller genre. And talking about immersive reading experiences, the next book I'm going to show you is The Truth About the Harry Quebert Affair by Joel Dicker. I read this last year, and it was actually my favorite book last year. And I'm not going to tell you like a lot about the plot or anything. I just want to tell you that this was like exactly the kind of book that I love. It's about writers and readers, and there's a mystery, a murder mystery. So in a way, it's a whodunit, but with a literary twist. And I don't know, this was like so immersive. I read it during the summer, so it meant I could sit all day long reading, and it was just like the best reading experience. The next book I'm gonna show you is The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling. This came out some years ago when I was still in college, and that particular day I got up, I went to college, they were selling this at the bookstore in college, so I bought it, and honestly, there was no way I could have this in my book bag and not be reading it. So I decided, the hell with college, I'm not gonna go to class today. So instead of going to class, I took my brand new copy of The Casual Vacancy and I went straight to the library, the college library, and I just read and read and read all day long, and that's probably the only day in my life that I have intentionally skipped school. Okay, the next book I'm gonna show you is Big Fish by Daniel Wallace. I read this back when I was living and studying in New York, and I actually bought this copy of Big Fish because the Broadway musical adaptation of Big Fish was on theaters, and so I saw the play like 4 times. I absolutely loved it. It became one of my favorite musicals of all time. And I picked the book up, and I just remember I was so enchanted by this book. And at that particular moment in my life, living and studying abroad in New York City, my favorite city in the world, and getting the chance to read this book and then go see the play and then read it again and then go see the play again was just a magical experience that I will never forget. Next up is The Cuckoo's Calling by Robert Galbraith or J.K. Rowling, and this book has a great story attached to it. So The Cuckoo's Calling had been around, had been released for quite some time, until one day J.K. Rowling publicly said that she was really the writer. She was Robert Galbraith. So when this happened, this became immediately sold out. But that very same day that J.K. Rowling said she was Robert Galbraith, that day I was in London. I live in Mexico, but I went to Europe. And that day I was in London, and I managed to get my copy of The Cuckoo's Calling before it was sold out entirely. So it was a great, it has a great story attached to it, just how I discovered the book and how I managed to get this book exactly at the right moment, exactly the right day. Now, because I was in Europe and I was traveling, I could not read it. So I just kept it, and I came back to Mexico, and immediately I moved to New York. So I went to New York, and this was the first book that I read when I was in New York. And I started reading The Cuckoo's Calling in Central Park. There's this garden in Central Park that is based on The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And I just sat there with my book in Central Park and I started reading The Cuckoo's Calling. So this book has a great story attached to it. Then also talking about New York City, I have this book, The Faun Art Stars by John Green. I absolutely loved this book and it definitely reminds me of a specific time and place. When I was living in New York, I took a road trip to Washington, and while I was on the bus, I read The Faun Art Stars, and I just remember I was so immersed in my book, I did not put it down. I read it like in 1 or 2 sittings. This book really made that road trip for me, and I just remember being so in love with this book on that particular time of my life. And number 10, the last book that I'm going to show you is actually 2 books because they are part of a series. And it should come as no surprise, it's the Harry Potter series. But I only chose 2 books that I think have the strongest memories attached to them. The first one of which is The Half-Blood Prince. This came out when I was about, well, what was it? This book came out in 2005, 10 years ago, so that means I was 13 years old. And I remember the morning that this came out, my father drove me to the bookstore and got me a copy of Half-Blood Prince, and I immediately locked myself up in my house and I started reading and reading and reading and reading and reading until I finished. And just, how can you not remember reading a Harry Potter novel for the very first time? And the other Harry Potter book that I have in this list is, of course, The Deathly Hallows, the last one. This has the strongest memory ever attached to it because the day that this was released, I was there at Mexico City's biggest midnight release party, at Mexico's biggest bookstore. I was there in full costume with my wand, and I just remember having the best time, and I was so anxious. And when I finally got my copy of Deathly Hallows, I felt like I was complete. And even though it was super late at night, I went straight home and I sat on my bed and I started reading, and I will never forget that. So there you go, guys. Those are the 10 books that I wanted to mention in the time and place book tag. If you feel like you want to do it, just do the tag and just let me know on the comments down below if you have heard or enjoyed some of the books that I mentioned in this video, or if you would like to know more information. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next video.